Morning, everyone, and welcome to this virtual event hosted by the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. Sorry that we started a little bit late. We're having technical difficulties with one of the presenters. We want to thank you for joining us, and we appreciate your interest in the work that we do. My name is Michael Van Beek, and I'm the Director of Research at the Mackinac Center. I'll be moderating this event for you today. Let's jump right into the topic. The global coronavirus pandemic is presenting an unprecedented challenge to society. Governor Gretchen Whitmer believes this challenge requires unprecedented use of gubernatorial power. As such, the governor has assumed unilateral control over state policies related to the pandemic, issuing orders that affect the daily lives of millions of Michiganders. Meanwhile, the people's elected representatives, the legislature, has been shut out of the entire decision-making process. No other governor in Michigan history has attempted to use these emergency powers in this way, and with good reason. It's unconstitutional. And that's why the Mackinac Center Legal Foundation filed a lawsuit against the governor, a lawsuit that the Michigan Supreme Court agreed to hear. And that's the subject of this event, Governor Whitmer's unconstitutional use of emergency powers. To talk about this issue, we have with us Dr. Randal Baker. Dr. Baker is a bariatric physician at Grand Health Partners in Grand Rapids. In addition to serving patients, Dr. Baker also conducts his own research and has presented findings in Spain, Japan, and France. Dr. Baker is one of the clients in the Mackinac Center's lawsuit against the governor. Joining Dr. Baker will be Patrick Wright. He is the Vice President for Legal Affairs at the Mackinac Center and Director of the Mackinac Center Legal Foundation. A former Michigan Supreme Court Commissioner and Assistant Attorney General for the state of Michigan, Patrick has been with the center for 15 years. But before we get to our presenters, I have one last introduction, and that's for Joe Lehman, who will speak next. Joe is the president of the Mackinac Center and has been since 2008, but he's been in the freedom fighting movement even longer when he joined the center in 1995. So take it away, Joe.
Thanks a lot, Mike, and thanks to all of the folks tuning in today, Mackinac Center friends and supporters. Your support makes our work possible, and even though this case that you will be hearing about today is highly important for the entire state, it's not the only thing that the Mackinac Center is working on. And we have just published a review of Michigan's corporate welfare programs, for example, and you'll be interested in one of those findings there. We found that only 3 of 9 Michigan corporate welfare programs had any significant effect on job creation at all. The ones and when you add it all up, it cost more than $600,000 per job per year for the jobs that they claimed were created. And so now, at a time that the COVID-related lockdowns have severely disrupted state budgets and municipal budgets, we believe that the time has never been better to severely curtail the corporate welfare programs that members of both major political parties seem to love, handing out favors to select corporations. We've also continued our work educating workers around the country, government workers in schools and municipal and state and local governments who have been coerced into supporting a union. They no longer have to live under that coercive regime due to a decision at the U.S. Supreme Court 2 years ago called Janus. That was the Janus decision, and we're educating workers around the country, and more than, by our count so far, more than 10% of the workers have decided that they don't need to have any relationship with the union that purported to represent them. So I'm here today actually doing some traveling. I don't travel as much as I used to, but I'm in Washington, D.C. today for business, and you're looking at my plain hotel room walls. And the streets are pretty strange in Washington right now. There's very little traffic on the streets, few people walking around, not much is open. And perhaps one of the saddest things that I saw was a security perimeter has been extended around the White House out to distances that I've never seen before, even enclosing Lafayette Park and enclosing the pedestrian mall on the north side of the White House. Hopefully, these measures are temporary, but when you come to Washington now, that's what you see. And this is the world that we live in now, and this is the hand that we've been dealt. But thanks to your support, the Mackinac Center is trying to make sure that Michigan does not become a place where the citizens' freedoms are curtailed indefinitely and at the whim of a single person. So thanks again for all your support and for tuning in. And Mike, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Let's get this conversation going. But before we start, I want to just let viewers know that they can get involved if they'd like. There is a question and answer box on your screen, Q&A, and there you can enter in questions that we can see. And towards the end of the conversation, we'll try to answer as many of those questions as we can. We have hundreds of people on the call, though, so please forgive us if we don't get to every single one of those, but we will try our best. So I'll start here and ask a question for Dr. Baker. Can you explain, Dr. Baker, how the governor's executive orders affected your practice and why you chose then to file this lawsuit with the help of the Mackinac Center?
Yes, hi. Thank you for having me. So our practice is basically a combination of a surgical and medicine practice. We do general surgery. We have a medical piece. We do weight loss medicine and surgery in addition to endoscopy. So we do screening for colonoscopy for colon cancer and esophageal disease as well. So our practice was very busy. We were rolling along. I'd heard from my son about what was happening in China and thought, man, I can't imagine this would happen here, and then started to hear the news about it. But the surprising thing is that we were told that we had to shut down essentially because non-essential or elective type medicine was going to be put on hold. Most practices in medicine are basically dealing with elective medicine or essential or non-essential medicine. It's not really non-essential, but that's what we were told. And so, for instance, a lot of the things that we do are screening for cancer, things like that. So basically 90% of our practice was going to be shut down because of this order. Now, the amazing thing is it wasn't just saying you can't do these things, but it was saying there's a criminal penalty as a physician, a criminal penalty for me or for the hospitals if we're caring for patients. Now, if you go back in time, you'll remember the reason for this was because the fact that we were going to flatten the curve and we had to avoid any kind of surges in the hospital systems, and especially to make sure that we had enough PPE. So basically we had to furlough most of our patients, most of our employees. We had to call our patients and say, we cannot see you, we can't do your procedures at this point. And everything basically came to a halt. We basically, there was not much we could do at that point. So I'll stop there. There's more to the story. You can ask the next question as we go on.
Yeah, well, just to follow up right with that, Dr. Baker, can you talk a little bit about how these your inability to provide services impacted some of your patients, and maybe specifically about how when we call something an elective procedure, it's not really what we might think the way we use that term normally?
Yes. So if you understand medicine as a whole, we can have a category of what's elective or what's emergent. I did trauma surgery for a number of years. Well, that's obviously an emergent. Somebody comes in, has a bad accident, they're bleeding to death, you got to take them to the operating room. But the rest of medicine is considered elective, but it really isn't. What we're trying to do is take care of problems before they become urgent or before cancer, for instance, spreads so that it has a much more greater impact on the patient. So that whole portion was going to be shut down. Now, just to back up, so what's happening is we can't take care of our patients. They're calling us. I mean, never in all my years did I ever expect to be told you can't do what you trained for, you know. you go to medical school for 4 years, you do residency, you do a fellowship, you do all this time, and now you can't take care of these patients, and they're calling. So what kind of issues are they having? I'll give you some examples. Some of these were mentioned in the articles and I think on the video. If you had a patient that had a routine gallbladder, you couldn't do it. Now, if it was an urgent emergent gallbladder, then you could do it. Well, where is that line? Patients were having abdominal pain staying at home. One example was somebody had appendicitis. He didn't know it was appendicitis, stayed home because they didn't want to go into the hospital. They heard you can't have anything unless it's an emergency. They didn't think it was an emergency. When they finally did end up coming in, it's because it perforated at home, and by that time, infection was spreading all over the abdomen. So these kind of things were happening. A pregnant gal who developed gallbladder issues, and it was getting worse. So there was one of my other patients, and I think this was in the article as well. This lady was referred to me by another physician and needed to have surgery. Again, it's considered elective, and we couldn't do it. And she ended up attempting to commit suicide. It was a serious attempt. She ended up in the psych med unit, and the psychiatrist called me and said, Dr. Baker, she needs to have this done. I said, I know, I can't do it. They will not let us do the surgery. And the sad thing is that during this whole time, we are not seeing significant surges in the hospital. I mean, the hospital was laying people off. I mean, this is one of the most sad things about this whole story and the way this is played out, and that is the very institution that you need for these people and for COVID patients is the institution you're hurting. You're hurting them for a couple of reasons. One is the institution needs, and they get most of their support and most of the profit from the hospital comes from elective procedures, cancer screening, things like that. That's where most of the profit comes. And so suddenly you cut that off, and that's not happening. And then you got all these staff, and you don't know what to do with them, so they're shifting people around, they're furloughing patients. And so the very system that's supposed to help the patients and be there for the patients, we're gutting in the process of doing this. So it's just a mess. I've never seen anything like this. And I understand when this first started, people didn't quite get what was going on. But by having this blanket unilateral block of allowing us to do these procedures and see these patients is just plain wrong.
Thank you, Dr. Baker. I want to turn to Patrick now. And Patrick, can you explain a little bit of the origins of the lawsuit and where it is now and what we should expect to see in the future?
Sure. We originally filed the suit in federal court, but what happened is the federal judge said that there's a couple of state law questions, what the governor can do under the statutes as interpretation of state law, and whether or not they are permissible under Michigan's Constitution, that are so important to Michigan State that we're going to send those questions over to the Michigan Supreme Court. So there's two questions that are going before the Michigan Supreme Court, whether she has the power under the statutes to do this as they read, and if so, whether or not that violates Michigan's Constitution. It's going to be argued September 2nd at 9:30 a.m. It's going to be on Zoom, so I imagine anybody who's interested in watching what we're doing right here can also watch. Essentially, our arguments come down to the 1945 Act cannot be read to give the governor unlimited power to do what she wants as long as she believes there's an emergency for as long as she wants. That there has to be a time limit. We look at the time limit that comes from the 1976 Act, which is 28 days, and the legislature has the power to extend it. After something around 50-something days, the legislature said, okay, this is, while extremely important question, and everybody here agrees with that, it's no longer one where we're going to give our power to make the laws and make public policy. We're no longer going to allow the governor to do that. And that's what our suit's about.
Can you explain a little more background about the two state laws that are at play here and kind of where they come from and why we have these laws?
The 1945 Act came as a direct consequence of a 1943 race riot that occurred down in Detroit. And this is one of the points we make in our brief, which is that the law, if you read it, it is talking about mayhem, and things of that nature. And so it's really limited to situations where we have an ongoing civil unrest. That was the 1945 Act. That act does not contain in its express terms a time limit to it. And to the extent that it allows unlimited power, we say it either has to be construed with the 1976 Act, which is a little bit broader, contains more kinds of things, might include the diseases. We're not challenging the constitutionality of the 1976 Act. We think that the 28 days that is given under that act when there is an emergency is permissible under Michigan's Constitution. And so it's really this unlimited power that goes forever, according to the governor, that is what is the focus of our challenge.
What is the governor's argument? What sort of legal case does she build that says that she can partake in this kind of action?
Argument essentially that her powers must exist because that she needs them to. Essentially, she wants to make decisions and she doesn't want anybody to have to compromise with. She wants to be able to do what she wants when she wants because she believes that the situation still requires immediate action. And our point with this is that we've been in this now for over 150 days. In March 10th, when we were first dealing with our COVID, we knew a lot less about the disease. We knew a lot less about social distancing. We knew a lot mentioned about its transmission, its effects, things of that nature. And at this point, it becomes a very important public policy matter, but it's not something where inaction is potentially dangerous anymore. This is a situation where we can have reasoned discussions, go through the normal legislative process, and follow the concept of lawmaking that this state has used since 1837.
Okay, good, thanks. Dr. Baker, I want to go back to you and ask you if there was a way that the governor could have taken a different approach to this issue. The emergency orders that came out on March 10 and in the weeks that followed talked a lot about flattening the curve, as you mentioned. Was there a way in your mind that we could flatten the curve without having to restrict all these elective surgeries and put the hospitals in the kind of situations that the governor put them in?
Yeah, well, yes, I'd like to answer that question, but I'd like to say one other comment first. We didn't disagree with it for the first couple of weeks as everybody was trying to get a handle on it. But the problem was when we started to see these issues, we tried to reach out and we couldn't get anywhere. So I'll give you an example. There are about 140 businesses in West Michigan that started to see the negative impact of what was happening from this overarching reach of the lockdown. So we tried to get together and we actually wrote a letter to meet with the governor to try to talk to the governor about some of the concerns that we had. And this was not just all medicine, it was a variety of different groups. So we did that and we got nowhere. They wouldn't meet with us, they wouldn't talk to us. So then what we did is we reached out to our legislators. So reached out to Democratic and Republican legislators. And what was interesting is they from both different parties, they said they agreed and they understood this, that made sense. And then we asked them and said, is there a way that this can be communicated? And they said, well, at this time, she wasn't listening to the legislature. And even though they voted not to continue, they said, we can't get through, we're not getting impact. So that's the time that we decided, okay, we need to proceed and consider doing a lawsuit. So in retrospect, what I think could have happened differently is, I think if the legislature was involved, the voice that we have as people actually gets communicated better to those that are making the decisions. It's really important. We need to be able to have a voice. And if we're not able to have a voice because of the fact that the legislators aren't actually part of the process, that's a big, big problem.
Yeah, and I'd like to build, Go ahead, Doc. I was going to build off Dr. Baker's point there, and that is that, Michigan's a state with 10 million people. It's got 276 cities, 83 counties, 1,240 townships, and 540 school districts. These 110 state representatives and 38 state senators, they hear these local voices, they get their concerns, they bring the expertise back from their districts, and they bring it to Lansing. And if this is what's supposed to go into the mix of making the better decisions. When you cut that off, you have one single person trying to understand everything that's going on in this large, diverse state, and you can get to disasters faster. Their question is, have the governor done some things right? Absolutely. Has she done some things wrong? I think everybody would agree with that. There's a study out recently that we're going to see an uptick in cancer diagnoses because people haven't, or cancer deaths because people haven't been going and getting their screenings because we kept them away from the hospital. So these are some of the values that the governor's actions have cost us. They've cost us the benefit of all of these people out in these communities, just like Dr. Baker was saying, being able to speak through their representatives and have their input put into the decision.
Yes, and that's, I can't emphasize that enough. The second thing is, you mentioned the problems with cancer screening. We already have a huge increase in suicides. We have an increase in mental health issues. We have an increase in drug overdoses. We have an increase in patients that aren't coming for wellness checks, vaccinations. I mean, the down roll piece of this, and we're not measuring that. We just put the number of new COVID cases up, and we're not talking about all these other aspects. So it's a significant issue. The next thing I think is another important point, and that's this, and that is we were treating the whole state as if it was the same, and that's a problem. So, for instance, people don't understand this, but hospitals do triage on a regular basis. So when the influenza waves hit, and this tends to be January and February, sometimes the hospitals are so full that we have to postpone elective cases, and that already happens. The hospital keeps a handle on that. And I've had that a couple of times. They'll call and they'll say, look, we need to wait a week. Fine, great, we'll do that. I mean, most of these elective cases go home the same day or go home the next day. So they're not a big tax on the inpatient beds or the ICU. So that happens. And here's the idea. The local communities, the local hospitals they know how to do this. They can do this. So once the initial look happened, the first few weeks, and we saw what was going on, we needed to open up and let the professionals, the healthcare people who know how to triage, do this instead of some blanket thing from the state that doesn't understand those differences. And that's just a key thing. Again, legislators are there. If this was communicated through the legislators, they would recognize that.
And this is all sort of interesting in light of what's happening right now, which is school districts are deciding whether or not to open in person or to go virtual or online. And all those decisions, the governor is basically allowing the local school districts to make those decisions themselves, following the same logic, Dr. Baker, that you just outlined, which is those local school boards, those local superintendents, they know what's best for their local community and their kids, and how, they're the experts on keeping them safe. So it's odd that when it came to hospitals, we had a one-size-fits-all policy, and when it comes to schools, we have a local control. Let the local elected officials decide. One of the things that I wanted, Patrick, for you to discuss a little bit is the argument that I sometimes read in the media about this lawsuit, and that is that it is dangerous because it would strip the governor of her emergency powers. Can you address that question?
Sure. There's a couple of presumptions that are built into that. One of those is that if we weren't doing what the governor wants, we'd be doing nothing. And I don't think that that's accurate. The legislature, we just saw this, you were discussing the schools earlier, the legislature and the governor just came through and worked on a giant school package regarding who can do what regarding school opening. So obviously there is the ability, there always is the ability to legislate. So if we don't have the governor doing unilateral things, we still have the opportunity to do things through the normal legislative process. Some of the decisions that the governor have made have undoubtedly been the right ones. Some of them are questionable. We are discussing the long-term effects of shutting down hospitals. It's probably cost lives. There's some question as to whether or not her activities related to nursing homes. Has that cost lives? So yes, it makes it easier to make decisions, but sometimes it gets us to the wrong decisions faster. And that's not a benefit. So the nice thing about building consensus through legislation is you have more buy-in, you have more people accepting the process, and you have less strife and concern about it, but hopefully you also get better policy. And there is a question right now of whether or not we're getting the best policy.
So go ahead, Dr. Baker.
Yeah, I just want to give an analogy in the healthcare system for this. When we have a patient that comes in and has an issue, we will oftentimes have consultation occur where we have different specialties come together. We get different healthcare members, and that always ends up being a stronger end product. We have a better idea to bounce things off of each other. And, the thing that bothers me a lot about this is, if you look at how our state constitution and our government is set up, particularly even at the federal level, is that we have separation of powers. And there's a reason for that. And you've heard the old saying, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the concept is that we need to have accountability. We need to have checks and balances. It's important to have more voices in on these things. And I think that's the saddest thing about this, and that is that the voices weren't being heard. The hospitals today are still in dire financial straits. There's a number of them that are probably going to go under. There's just so many ramifications of this that are still happening. And I think if we look back historically and say, there's a reason that there's separation of powers, there's a reason we have a legislature. And it isn't for them to have to not be able to sit at the table and communicate. So I think those are important concepts as well.
And that's one of the arguments as part of the lawsuit. Is that right, Patrick? That the 1945 Act is unconstitutional because it doesn't guarantee those separation of powers?
Yes, to the extent that it allows the legislature's power, the ability to create public policy for the state, and that it takes it from that branch of government and gives it to the executive, in this case, the Governor Whitmer, without really any limit on it, then it's unconstitutional. If there is a limit on it that is borrowed from the 76 law as to the 28 days and sort of a legislative resolution of extensions, then that's probably going to be constitutionally permissible. A unlimited giving away of legislative power, however, is unconstitutional.
Okay, we're getting lots of questions in the Q&A box. I just encourage viewers, keep them coming. I'm going to start picking up on some of those. One of them that I saw, Patrick, this will probably be best for you, is what happens if the case succeeds, if the Supreme Court rules in our favor, and what will happen to all these executive orders? What will happen to policies related to COVID if that occurs?
Well, what would happen is that the executive orders that are done through these statutes would no longer have any force of law. The governor, however, during this has kind of started working on backups, going through the administrative rulemaking process. And so she's going to have a bunch of things through just normal administrative rules that would be in place even if we were to win. The second thing, and the more important thing that would happen if we win, is that the governor would walk over to the legislature or pick up a phone and they would talk to each other. And they would say, okay, this is the world we live in now. What is it that we have that we agree on? What is it that we disagree on? And where can we work and create good public policy? There is absolutely nothing that prohibits the governor and the legislature from coming up with the Michigan COVID Act of 2020 and setting all kinds of policy within it. There is all that's stopping it right now is that we have a governor who doesn't believe she needs to compromise.
And Patrick, how could we handle pandemics or emergency situations, though, if we don't have this act on the books from 1945, or if it's ruled unconstitutional? Would that limit the state's ability to handle emergent, critical disaster type scenarios?
No, one of the big concessions we make in this lawsuit is we say that the 1976 process is legal and constitutional. And that's the process where the governor can declare an emergency or a disaster of this type and has essentially 28 days of free reign unless the disaster itself ends before then. And then she can, or he, if there's somebody else in the office, can extend, that governor can extend that by asking the legislature for permission. And we're saying that that is permissible. Even aside of that particular law, there is a communicable diseases law that's already on the books. So even if we win our case, there are two laws that could help in this situation. Right now, the problem is that the governor is contending that she wants all of the absolute power that's in a law, the 1945 law, that we believe is unconstitutional.
And you mentioned earlier that there are other administrative law methods that the governor could potentially use. Can you talk more about what those are and how that might work?
Sure. Well, we have health acts, we have MIOSHA, health, safety, occupational administration portions. All of these things are laws that are currently on the books, where the administrative state, the bureaucracies can come up with rules because the legislature has given them clear mandates as to what they're supposed to prevent and to how. And so using that process, you can come up with various work rules, perhaps related to dealing with COVID patients under the communicable diseases law, or through the MIOSHA law, because we now have this new health hazard that there's certain ways that we can deal with it. But these are all processes that have been found to have constitutional protections to them. They have due process. They have input from the citizenry. These are not unilateral decisions made by one person who has unlimited power as to time and to scope as to what she wants to do.
And Dr. Baker, one of the things that you talked about a little bit earlier was just kind of the overall effects of COVID plus the lockdowns that we've had. I see a question on here about is there a better way that we can sort of balance the costs, all of these health costs and economic costs related to this entire episode? Is there a better way that we could manage and handle those and weigh out those costs?
Well, that's a good question. And I mean, part of it is with the retrospectoscope, obviously, you've got to allow, medicine does not have a large margin. I don't think people realize this. If you go back when I started out in practice a number of years ago, even the nonprofit hospitals had a pretty good margin of profitability. They would always, redo things in the hospital and get the newest equipment and so forth. But in the past 15 years or so, that margin has gotten pretty narrow. So what that means that in this crisis, when you turn down a certain part of business, so you're not doing those elective procedures, you're not doing the colonoscopies and the screening, you're significantly impacting the institutions financially. So this is a broader healthcare question. I think the bottom line is, though, we have to be very careful, because when the next whatever it is comes, we have to make sure that the healthcare systems stay doing what they're supposed to do. So we cannot sacrifice part of the healthcare system in the process of doing that. And then the next thing is just a little bit off the topic, but I just would encourage people, maybe some of the folks that are listening today, there's still a lot of fear out there. And the problem is that there's a number of patients that still are not showing up for healthy visits and screening, and that needs to be done. It can be done very, very safely. A number of my patients, when it was finally time we could go to the operating room, go to surgery, they're very worried about catching things in the hospital. And I'm just going to tell you, the hospital's they've done a fantastic job. They're very safe. They know how to deal with communicable diseases if they happen, and they handle it in a very good way. You're safer at a hospital in these kind of circumstances, and they know how to do this. So I just want to encourage people to take that, to know that the hospitals will do well. If you need to get your visits, if you need to see the dentist, try to do those things. And next time we come to something like this, hopefully we won't shut down part of the healthcare system that will end up hurting it in the long term.
That was always a little bit troubling to me, too, Dr. Baker, because of all the institutions that we have in society, the healthcare and medical providers should be the ones best prepared to deal with transmission of diseases between people. I mean, they're often the safest and cleanest places that I see. So, if people could be safe anywhere, even in midst of a pandemic, it seems like a hospital might be a good place. I wanted to, one of the questions we have on here is talking a little bit about, asking about broader constitutional rights under the U.S. Constitution that people have in Michigan, and how those interact with these emergency laws and emergency mandates that the governor has created. Are there, does U.S. constitutional rights that every citizen has, how do those play out in these scenarios? Patrick, can you address that?
Yes, the U.S. constitutional rights, the way most people think about them, there's two different types of rights. The right that we are suing for under the state constitution is what's known as a structural right. I'll get back to that in just a second. However, when people think of constitutional rights, most often they think about them as a fundamental individual right. And the Supreme Court has indicated that these fundamental individual rights can, at this point, be overcome by a state's interest in dealing with the pandemic. So we've had people who are saying, hey, I have a fundamental right to worship. And the Supreme Court has said, no, they can ban you from going to church right now. States can ban you from going to church. We've had people say that, I want to have the ability to earn a living. Well, that right hasn't even been recognized by the Supreme Court yet. And again, the United States Supreme Court has indicated so far that a state has the ability to say, no, fighting the pandemic is sufficient to do that. It's one of the reasons why we have chosen what is the structural right. And the structural right is not about the decision itself, but really about who gets to make the decision. So clearly we disagree with some of the policies. We've been talking with Dr. Baker about the long-term health effects of shutting down access to health care and the downstream effects, negative downstream effects that that's going to have. But it goes to a larger question, and that is, who should be deciding this? And that structural right is something that we are hoping is going to give us a little bit more of a footing in making a legal challenge than we've seen with the fundamental federal constitutional rights to date. Those have not done well in court yet.
Got a question here for Dr. Baker. How do you feel about the data and the health information that we get that's made public from the state concerning COVID and the spread of the disease and those sorts of things? Have you made use of those? Are those helpful?
Yeah, I think that the state actually has been showing us the data pretty well. I can't say the same thing about the media. The media, unfortunately, I think is hyping this. So So for instance, when we first started out, we're talking about the cases, and the cases, people that were positive of the cases were reported. And then we started talking about the deaths. And then if you read a certain article, there's certain articles that you'll read, it'll talk, now it shifts back to the cases. And what we really need to know is a couple of things. We need to know total cases, that's an important thing. The death rate's important, and how's that changing? I mean, that's a key thing. So if you just show the death rate, that now it's up 10 more, it's 100 more, it's 5 more, whatever it is, it doesn't help you put it in perspective. And I found actually one paper, and I won't mention it, but one paper in the state actually is the most balanced in terms of giving you all that information. And I think that's key, because I think a lot of people are fearful just because they keep hearing about another case. And the thing is, particularly in the last few weeks or so, the vast majority of the new cases are asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic. In fact, many of them don't know it. In fact, even the listing of patients that are in the hospital, which is very low now, but what's interesting, a lot of those patients are positive. They're not in the hospital because of the COVID. They're there for something else. We're testing all the patients. So if they're going to come to have surgery, we test them. And there's a high percentage of those now that are mildly symptomatic or asymptomatic. So what I think would be very helpful is if the media would take it and do it in a balanced approach that describes it in a very balanced way. I don't think that's happened. I think you sell more papers and maybe more articles if it's more hyped. But that doesn't help people. It doesn't help patients. It doesn't help the society. It just breeds more fear. And that's why I got back to that earlier. People need to realize this thing is real, but we can deal with it, and there's appropriate ways to deal with it. And sitting home and not coming to see your doctor, not seeing your dentist, not having your screening, and not doing vaccines is not an appropriate way to respond. That has a greater risk than if you proceed with those things.
Patrick, I had a question from you from the Q&A box about Unlock Michigan. This petition that is going around that might make it onto the November ballot that would, that would be sent to the legislature that would repeal the 1945 Act. You mentioned a little bit about this before, but can you talk again about what the outcome of that might be if that 45 Act is repealed?
Sure. Well, you have to get into a position where it can be repealed. So first you need to actually gather the signatures. You're going to have to go through a process. Perhaps Secretary of State Benson decides to move it along quickly. Perhaps she doesn't. Perhaps she waits until the election to see what the constitution of the new legislature is. So there's a possibility that even if the signatures are gathered, that by the time the legislature actually gets it, which would be in maybe January, that we might have a new legislature. But it is doing essentially what we are looking to do in this lawsuit, and that is to say that if we were to lose in the court case and the Supreme Court were to say that this law is constitutional, it is an attempt to repeal it through direct democracy. So it is definitely a useful arrow in the quiver of people that are very determined to try and make sure that the governor doesn't act unilaterally. So if that's something that's important to you, you can keep that in mind when deciding whether or not you would want to sign a petition.
And Patrick, there's another question here that you can address maybe is about what kind of ramifications are there for the governor if she loses this case, if the 1945 Act is declared unconstitutional, or if her actions are declared illegal. Are there any kind of ramifications for the governor herself?
It's very unlikely that there would be. There's a possibility. The Michigan Supreme Court just had a decision out where they talked about damages for violating the state constitution. It's the first time that they've ever discussed that in over 150 years. So it's a possibility. Impeachment, while also a possibility, seems unlikely. I can't imagine in these hard partisan times that there would be sufficient Democratic support, even if the governor's actions were found to be unconstitutional. I think the most likely outcome is that people that are very upset with her can I guess there's a possibility of a recall, but the most likely event is you're going to have to wait until 2022 and take it out at the ballot box, assuming that you're upset with the governor, of course.
Question to either one of you. Have you had experience or knowledge of other approaches that governors have taken in other states? Maybe that, Dr. Baker, do you know of other states where the medical providers were not treated the same way as they were in Michigan? And Patrick, do you know of other states that maybe handled these emergency situations in a collaborative way rather than a unilateral one?
Yeah, I can speak first. Yes, there's a number of states where they did not shut down non-essential, quote, elective type procedures. Or I know some states where they did it for just a short period of time. And those states are doing so much better. In fact, one of the the negative impacts of the way this has played out in our state is a number of healthcare providers have left. They're like, I'm just not going to put up with this. I don't think people realize that a lot of physicians have had pay cuts. Even first line responders that were trying to deal with this, they were getting pay cuts because the institutions were hurting financially, even though they were the ones out on the front line trying to take care of this. So the bottom line is, yes, another number of other states did this a whole lot better than we did. And again, I think it comes back to this key point, and that is there was an opportunity for more voices to be heard. And in those other states, the legislatures were involved, and so those concerns were raised up the flagpole much faster.
On the legal side of it, I think we're on Executive Order 167. We might even be into the 170s. I've lost track. It's a little bit over 1 and change per day. So we've had enough matters keeping track of what's happening in Michigan. I know bits and pieces of other state Supreme Court cases. I am aware of things going on in South Dakota. I see news reports of things happening in New York, Texas, and in California. Where we're really focused on right now is what is going on in Michigan is improper. That much is absolutely clear, and we're trying to solve it. If the 45 Act gets repealed, does that also remove protections of the nursing homes that were put into place? The answer to that is going to be that all the executive orders that were entered after April 30th would become void. There might be some of them that have been incorporated in other new administrative rules that the governor has put in place properly under the Administrative Procedures Act in Michigan. We'll have to look and see how many of those have been done. But the short-term effect is that most of the executive orders would be declared void. Somebody's here's asking about a mask and exemptions. The mask is one of many executive orders. If you're having, getting a personal question of, hey, how come they won't give me an exemption is something that's a little bit too detailed for us to get into at this time. Reparations, we've already covered. Again, is it constitutional to deny a person the right to work? A lot of people are without jobs. We've had a lot of situations where the governor has turned on and off businesses. As of right now, those as a matter of federal constitutional law, it is probably permissible for the governor to do that. The question right now that we are asking that's so important in our case is whether or not that is permissible under state law and the state constitution. It is our belief that it is not, but that's a question that we are trying to litigate right now. Is there any chance the governor just sabotaged this presentation? I hope not. I hope that this is just a technical matter, and that there is going to be an interesting thing that's going to happen in that we'll be using Zoom at the Michigan Supreme Court. I watched the legislature's argument when they did it at the Court of Appeals about 2 weeks ago, and they too had some technical glitches. We actually prep and go through this the day beforehand so that all of our computers are supposed to work. all of the lighting, all of the microphones, all of the cameras. So I, on behalf of myself and my colleagues, I do apologize for our technical difficulties.
Hi, it's Mike Van Beek again, Director of Research at the Mackinac Center. Just wanted to say sorry about the technical difficulties that we experienced there at the end of the program, but I wanted to make sure to thank our presenters, Dr. Baker and Patrick Wright, for their participation, and wanted to let the audience know as well that you can get a recording of this video, and this event is available at the Mackinac Center's website at mackinac.org. And you can also find out more about future events that we will have in the near future. So thanks again for attending. Thanks for your support of our work, and we hope to see you again soon.